Welcome back, everybody, to me not doing what I promised to do, which is very much the story of my life because I suck at keeping promises or sticking to plans and all of that good stuff. Which is why we're not talking about Orbs of the Throne today, like I promised, but we're talking about the Claw of the Conciliator. I will get to Orbs of the Throne. I promise. I'll try to raid some tonight and record the video tomorrow morning. We'll see how that goes. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. But until then, I figured it's time to talk about Claw the Conciliator, Part 2 of The Book of the New Sun by Mr. Gene Wolfe. And this is obviously not going to be a review, because I feel like reviewing Part 2 of a book is ridiculous. It's like, literally, you don't need to review this. It's not even like a separate novel in any case. So yeah, you read the first one, you're gonna read the second one, and it's just as good as the first one. Maybe better, maybe worse, depending on your personal taste, but it's definitely, at this point. Also, it's an absolute masterpiece, so no further review needed. So let's dive into a bit of a discussion of it, shall we? Cheers. So, Book of the New Sun, Part 2. The Claw of the Conciliator. If you remember, the claw was that magical gem or whatever thing that Severian found, and it plays a large role in this one, in this novel, which, is why it's called The Claw of the Conciliator, right? And I feel, as a novel, it showcases a few things that are, in general, like very particular to Gene Wolfe's writing style. It also advances a lot of things within the Book of the New Sun kind of series, in a way. And then it has a few problematic things and takes in there as well. So we'll go through all of that in a way. Now, one thing that is very typical for Gene Wolfe's writing style, I spoke about that before, is recontextualizing things through information that was withheld from us before. And Gene Wolfe does that all the time because he has his first-person narrators that are not always sticking to the timeline, or if they're sticking to the timeline, they're oftentimes ignoring bits or mentioning them later on, or what have you. The large bit here being, well, obviously the perfect memory thing, and we're going to talk about that in a second, but also the fact that after a certain event in Claw of the Conciliator, and this is obviously full spoiler what I'm doing here, but I guess you already knew that. After a certain event, Severian, our first-person narrator, is no longer just Severian, but also has at least parts of Thekla's personality in him, because, yeah, he's eaten her in the cannibal way, that's what I'm trying to say here, with the Alzabo. And now, if you understand that means that a lot of stuff that, like the person that is writing and telling us this story, is both Severian and a specific version of Thekla, which recontextualizes a lot of the stuff that we see in Shadow of the Torturer, because there we didn't know that. And one way we see that this time round is that most of the recollections of Thekla's imprisonment and interactions with Severian are now told from Thekla's point of view. Well, still through Severian, but, through Thekla's point of view, which makes the whole thing very more like, recontextualize it, because you read book 1, and it's not exactly clear, or it's very open, whether Severian and Thekla actually had a sexual relationship, or just a, friendship, kind of like, well, obviously was in love with her, but in weird ways and whatnot, because we have no depictions of any sexual interactions there. But now we get them, and we mostly get them from Thekla's point of view. So that recontextualizes stuff there. And this is something that will keep happening a lot we will, that's Gene Wolfe or Severian, our narrator, will tell us things, and then half a book later or a book later, he'll tell us something else that will put everything that we've read so far into a very, very different light. And obviously, this is part of Gene Wolfe's technique, and it's something that he has done in every single book that I've read by him, which so far have been the Book of the New Sun, the Wizard and Knight duology, and A Borrowed Man, and The Land Across. I have finally gotten the Latro in the Mist, Soldier in the Mist, Soldier of Sidon, Soldier of Arete trilogy as well. I'll be definitely diving into that one before the end of the year, I can tell you that. Because I've been waiting for this one to be available in audio for years now. But anyway, so this recontextualizing is something that happens a lot. And sometimes it's things that we as readers could not have guessed, and sometimes it's things that we as readers have figured out long ago, and Severian is just like too stupid to actually figure it out, because Severian is not a very smart narrator, which once again is part of what Gene Wolfe does with his narrators, that oftentimes he has them not understand things that you as the reader, or we as readers, with a bit of distance and obviously the leisure of rereading bits and going over bits again and again, can figure out fairly easily. Now, is that fair? Is that like a good technique? I don't know. I personally appreciate it, because what it also does, it makes us reflect on the fact that oftentimes in our lives, our daily lives, we don't figure shit out because, there's life happening. We don't have time to think about things. We are too emotional to actually think about things and so forth. What Wolfe does through Severian is kind of drive that point home, which can be really, really frustrating when you read it. One of the best cases there is obviously the story of Jolanta, which we're going to talk about more in a second. But the fact that Jolanta is obviously the serving girl they meet, that Dr. Talos and Baldanders and him, Severian, meet at the, fairly early on in Shadow of the Torturer. The fact that she is the same person as that, just, with whatever applied magics or technology to make her look according to a specific beauty ideal, let's put it that way. And Severian just doesn't understand it. I feel most readers will understand it fairly immediately after starting, even in near the end of Shadow of the Torturer, when they meet her again, when Severian and Dorcas meet her again. That's probably when you as a reader will definitely understand what's going on there. I feel like that. Maybe I'm just also, prejudiced because I've read it before a bunch of times, and at this point I just know. And the one that Severian doesn't understand it until the end of her arc, when she dies, or is dead, or whatever. Yeah. And that can be super, super frustrating, because there's a bunch of things going on in this book where you realize something and Severian just is too stupid to notice. So that is one of the things that we see a lot going on in this book, because, now we have had more time with Severian and the Book of the New Sun. We have had the chance to see this recontextualizing through added information or withheld information play out more than just in Shadow of the Torturer, where it is already happening, but on a much smaller level, or in a way that is less easy to understand. Add to that, obviously, the idea of Severian not understanding things and describing them in a way that are different to our way of looking at things. And you realize that very little is as it seems in these books. Now let's look at the next thing that Claw does, and that makes Claw feel different from Shadow of the Torturer. And that is the world. Now, if you read just Shadow of the Torturer, you can read it as a straight-up fantasy story. Yes, you kind of know that it takes place in the far future because there's hints and whatnot. But the overall actions, small boy being raised by a guild, going out, being sent out after a misdemeanor, making his way through the city for the first time, having adventures. That's very, very, very standard. And while there obviously is such a thing as technology in this world, it's very easy to overlook that or explain it just in the ways of magic, right? Transport animals are called destriers. Lances are apparently not just lances, but maybe guns or something else, some other kind of future weapon, who knows. You can read it as a straight-up fantasy. The weirdest thing that's happening in the entire book is probably the duel with the swords, with the plants. But that's about it. That's something you can probably find with your Clark Ashton Smith stories as well, if you're looking for them. But with Claw of the Conciliator, that is no longer such an easy thing, because we have more parts where technology plays a role. The idea that there is travel to and from other stars is made much clearer than it was in the first book, and we kind of meet people like that. We obviously meet Jonas, who's one of the most fascinating characters in this book, compared to the first one, definitely, who is, as we find out, an android. But first, he seems to be a human being with a metal arm prosthesis, and then we figure out that no, he's actually a metal person with a few flesh prostheses, which is interesting and fun to look at. It's once again one of those added information recontextualizing something, because it has sort of been there from the beginning on, and it's very fascinating to me because now I'm rereading it for the third or fourth time. I already know when I'm getting into reading that book, so I can pick up these hints and signs that I just totally didn't pick up when I first read it. For a long time at least. So there's that. So we have more of the technology aspect coming in there, plus the weirdness aspect. Now we have obviously that whole episode where Severian falls into that trap that Aja sets for him because she still wants the claw and all that other stuff, and he goes into that mine. We have that whole idea that mining happens there. Mining is no longer us digging bits out of the earth and smelting them and whatnot, like raw earths. No, mining is digging up the remainders of previous eons, of previous civilizations, and using them for something that can be straight up, people or technology and items like that, but it could also just, take up that stuff and recycle it into something new, which, is something we as human beings have already started when you look at how we deal with electronic trash and stuff like that, how we deal with that nowadays, or are starting to talk about, but obviously with a world that is millions or billions of years in the future, the idea of every bit of ground that we're standing on being meters and meters and meters of previous civilizations is just driven home in that regard. We also obviously have more references to other parts of fiction in a way, with the underground apes or ape-like creatures who seem to be humans that have mutated into ape-like figures through whatever reason we don't really know. It could be radioactive mutations, it could be something else, but it harkens back to stories by H.G. Wells. There's a bit of Planet of the Apes in there, I guess, if you really want to look at it that way. As I said, it's one of those things that make the book way weirder than feel weirder than Shadow of the Torturer, which already felt fairly weird, I would say. And then obviously we have the Alzabo and the whole scene with Thekla. Now the idea that there is an animal that can eat body parts and thus take on some of the body's memories and some of the body's memories and ideas and whatnot is already pretty fucking weird. It's not something that you haven't heard before, but it is super weird. To then have someone distill their glands to do the same thing as a human being and basically take on someone else's memories through eating them is fairly over the top weird, I would say. Now, obviously, we have the idea of having someone else's previous memories in, say, the Bene Gesserit way of doing that personality thing, doing that going on in Dune. But there it's not done by like physically actually eating a person. So yeah, and we have that happen here straight up, which, there you go. You realize you're no longer in Kansas when you're reading that part of the book. In fact, you're a couple of 1,000 kilometers south of Kansas, I assume. So yeah, throughout the entire story, Gene Wolfe, this part of the story, Gene Wolfe certainly turns up the weird, making his world way more unique. I mean, yeah, there's still a bit of Clark Ashton Smith in there. There's still a lot of, Jack Vance going on in there, but it's also just fairly odd and unique in a lot of other ways. Plus, we are getting really heavy into the symbolism and shit. There's like 2 main chapters in here that are just about that. One of them is obviously the story of the student and his son, which is a fairly odd deconstruction, reconstruction, and whatnot of the myth of Theseus, in which basically everything from the original story of Theseus and the Minotaur gets taken apart and put into something new, which kind of is really fascinating, because what we get is basically the idea of the ship of Theseus exercised on the story of Theseus. Like, is it still the story of Theseus, even though every single bit has been replaced by something else? Or is it now something unique? But it's just like fascinating to do that and have this kind of story within the story. Now, obviously, we have a lot of like stories within stories happening in this book in general, but this is one of the strongest ones. The other big weird symbolism chapter, obviously, is Dr. Taylor's play, described as how a play works, that being eschatology and Genesis. And yeah, that one's a mind fuck, to put it mildly. Now, there's several layers of stuff going on there that make it very, very interesting and fascinating. The first one is obviously the fairly odd way the whole thing works, is written, and so forth, which reminds me at least of passion plays of the Middle Ages and early modern times that take parts of a religious story, mostly biblical stories in Western Europe, obviously, and turn them into a morality play around that. And I've seen a bunch of them that took, for example, the story of the expulsion from paradise, from the garden, or the birth of Christ and the, what's it called, the 3 kings and whatnot. There's all these different parts of biblical stories that were turned into passion plays and morality plays, and those are fairly weird compared to what we might call your generic drama or tragedy, because those things were usually performed by lay players. It's not your Shakespeare. It's very different, and it has a bit of a ring of that to me, which is obviously also connected to the fact that it is full of religious imagery, full of sort of recognizable religious imagery, right? You have Adam and Eve and the land of Nod, which is kind of connected to the whole idea of the myth of Lilith and Cain and all of that crazy shit. And we have parts of that put in there and twisted in all kinds of ways. So Nod is, well, this dude who is a giant. And we have all these other bits and pieces in there that are just ridiculously all over the place. The other, obviously, really tricky bit about this play is that we as people, and we're going to talk about that in a second, and it has enough similarities that you can see parts of that story as either foreshadowing or different interpretations of stuff that happens to Severian within this book, which is also called the Book of the New Sun, because, like, in the story, that play is based on the Lost Book of the New Sun. It also harkens back, obviously, to the first chapter, which is all about death and rebirth, in a way, resurrection. So we have all of these connections, and what Gene Wolfe does here is he does something very, very postmodern, because he plays with our attempts to find solutions and find final interpretations and find answers. And there are no answers. I mean, there is bits and pieces that you can personally make answers to specific questions, but there is no way to interpret the entire play and have a definitive interpretation of Dr. Taylor's play. That just doesn't exist, but it's very, very difficult to read that and not try to do it and not try to figure it out, which is one of the great strengths of Book of the New Sun in general, because it very much, by having this overabundance of symbolism, it very much tricks us into trying to interpret it, into trying to figure it out, which we can't, because, you know, there is a very fairly straight up meaning in there at some point. And we're going to come to that when we wrap the whole thing up in, I don't know, a month or two, when we're finished with the Citadel of the Autarch. But all the rest in there is mostly our, as readers, personal experiences, our knowledge of stuff that we have already known, that we can fit somewhere. Like, for example, that whole, like, Theseus story. It's like, yeah, I've read the Theseus story. I wrote a university term paper on the evolution of the story of Theseus over time. So, yeah, of course, I see all these bits and pieces. If you have never read the story of Theseus, you'll just read it as a really fairly odd and weird story about someone fighting an ogre who's probably a battleship. Who knows? So yeah, the idea, like, that there are definite or definitive answers to questions is something that we have gotten way too accustomed to, especially in the fantastic and science fiction literature areas, I feel. And Gene Wolfe is just like head on, just demolishing that left and right wherever he goes. Now let's look at other parts of the book that are, I feel, fascinating aspects. And once again, this is just what I find interesting this time round. If you're reading it, you probably find other stuff very fascinating. If you're rereading it, you'll probably find even more other stuff fascinating, because it goes all over the place all the time. So let's look at 2 or 3 other aspects. The easy one, Jolanta. So Jolanta is turned into a Jolanta, desire, body image, and sexuality. Jolanta is turned into the most desirable woman by very, like, fairly. There's 2 things to it. One of them is, like, physical changes, what you might call cosmetic surgery at the end of the day, and the other part is that through either, like, hypnosis or any other thing, she gains the inner confidence and belief in her like attractiveness, basically. Now, from the descriptions that we get, it's fairly clear that, like, the physical shape she's in at that point is ridiculous, is physically almost impossible, or naturally very, very uncomfortable for her. We get that mentioned all the time, that she's, like, very uncomfortable. Her breasts are way too big, and her legs, you know, are also in the wrong shape, and her waist is way too thin. She must walk around all the time bent backwards with back pain and, you know, all the other stuff. And it's fairly clear that that is actually the case, which, you know, gives you, like, a commentary on what you might call beauty ideals that we have nowadays, because it's fairly obvious that that ridiculous, over the top depiction of a woman is very attractive to everyone, including our buddy Severian, who, to be honest, has not not the best image of women in general, but that's a different question. We have all of that going on there, and looking at our world and how people are sexualizing body images have shifted or not shifted over the last 100 years or so, you can say, yeah, sure, our beauty standards are fucking ridiculous, and it's a problem. It's a huge problem that they are still the way they are. Does Gene Wolfe go out and say that? Of course not. He just through making the whole thing work this way and giving us not Jolanta's perspective, but giving us Severian's perspective, who just falls for her and directly is like, whoa, boobs. Ideally makes us reflect that we would probably react the same way, unless we either have had personal experiences that show us that that is ridiculous, or are very, very, good at self-reflection and other stuff. So there's that aspect to it. The other aspect is the confidence aspect, which, is fairly important as well, although it's played down a lot. It doesn't come up that much in the novel. It's just in those small side comments where we talk about it, that we have that part shown in a way. A lot of it is self-confidence, and self-confidence is something that is very difficult to gain in a world that constantly puts you down for your appearance, for your, status in life, and all these other things. So having that as part of making her beautiful or appear attractive, is definitely an important aspect. Well, anyway, the really sad part, obviously, is that her attractiveness, Jolanta as a character, gets used pretty fucking hard by everyone and abused, because, you can see this as a commentary once again on all these aspects of sex work and female body images and whatnot, because she's made that way by Dr. Taylor to draw in the crowds, and once they no longer need her, they'll just drop her at the side of the street and let her die, which is as fucked up as it gets. And Severian doesn't really understand it, because he's an idiot and he's too much caught up in the system, which is one of those points that makes you rage at Severian. Now, there's another part that also makes you rage at Severian. That is obviously the point when he actually goes and has sex with Jolanta for reasons that are very, very difficult to understand and made me very, very uncomfortable. Because at the time, he's already in a what you might call relationship or whatever with Dorcas. Now, that one is also fucked up in a lot of ways, but that's a different story. And he just goes away, and for some reasons that are very difficult to determine, he just at some point maybe sexually assaults her, because he has some sort of hate thing going on there and just wants to hurt her or wants to abuse her, and then that's what he does. And this is one of those things where I feel like this kind of book can be really tough to read, because it really because you only get his perspective, and it really kind of makes you question how many people actually are that way. Could I myself be that way? I hope not, obviously. I don't think I've ever thought that way, but who knows? It's that kind of thing that makes this scene so creepy in so many ways. And the other part of that is that clearly Jolanta is kind of expecting that, because, yeah, she's made that bargain that gives her attractiveness, physical attractiveness, all in the hope to actually get the other kind of actual love or respect or whatever, which he never gets. Because everyone just uses her that way. And at some point, that's sort of the realization she has, and we kind of know the result there, which is that she certainly tries to hurt herself, and Severian once again tries to ignore that and thinks it might have been a bat that bit her. Chances of that are, however, very slim. But yeah, I feel compared to what is going on in Shadow of the Torturer, the themes in Claw of the Conciliator are way more mature. And Severian, who wasn't even like, a really smart or likable person in book one, he's even less of both in this one. So we'll talk about some more bits of pieces here, because, there's so much to talk about here that I keep forgetting bits, I guess. All right, Dorcas. Now, obviously, Dorcas is another very fascinating character. One of the really interesting bits here is that Dorcas is very much the person who actually understands how things work most of the time, who kind of makes the decisions for Severian, because Severian is not exactly, able to do anything reasonable. Which kind of reverses their roles. If you remember, there's a scene at the ending of Shadow of the Torturer when Dorcas and Severian walk into the clearing to Dr. Taylor's stage show, and he's like, death and innocence have shown up. And the question is always who is death and who is innocence. And obviously the answer is, like, on the surface, it's fairly easy. It's like Dorcas appearing rather childlike. It's obviously innocence, and Severian being a torturer and executioner is obviously death. But then again, Severian is so brutally naive and innocent in so many ways, and Dorcas has obviously been dead before. I think we can kind of take that for granted by now. Which makes the whole thing, once again, maybe flips it, but there is no definite answer here. There is no definite answer here, which once again is that big thing that Jane Wolfe does so well, that may drive a lot of readers fairly insane at this point. So, which other parts should we talk about that are important? Obviously, the Autarch, the House Absolute, the House Azure, because we find out that the Autarch is apparently also the guy who runs the brothel in book one. He's obviously androgynous in some way or another. Whether that means that he's a eunuch or it means that he's actually androgynous is, it's of no real concern here, but it's sort of the point there. We meet him again. We meet even some people from the House Azure running around dressed up as exaltants in the House Absolute, which is one of those main themes of like what is like real and what is appearance, and we won't get any answers on that one either. We also get the whole like who's in charge thing when we have the connection between Vodalas of the Woods, who's obviously also a commentary or reflection of Robin Hood, because you have to have your rebels, and they're always sitting somewhere in the fucking woods, pretending to be, lord of the forest, dressed the part with, a crown of leaves, and yeah. Seriously, go read The Hood by Lavi Tidar with more commentary on that. Anyway, my point is, we have all of that, and then we find out that Vodalas's contact in the House Absolute is actually the Autarch, who is his supposed enemy. But now, let's leave all of these bits behind. There's like ridiculously crazy shit going down there. We obviously also have the whole idea of the antechamber, which has become like a prison over time, which on the one hand helps us to establish how how long this thing is going, how far in the future we are here. The idea of people living in an antechamber, or like several generations that never left that room, that was an antechamber and became something of a prison. Now there's a lot of symbolism going on there. There is obviously an analogy to Plato's cave metaphor. There is the idea that we create our own prisons. There is layers on layers on layers of meanings in there. That are, once again, you can just pick and choose whichever works for you. But it's interesting and fascinating. But I want to go through most of that stuff real quickly. It's interesting. It's fun. It's not where the real meat of this book for me is, because one thing that we also get here is sort of a further picture of the overall conversation, or the overall conflict that is more on the religious or mystical level. Basically, the question here obviously is who are Erebus and Abaya and Scylla and so forth. Now we've kind of learned that those are giant beings that live under the ocean or in the ocean, because they can't live on land because they're too huge. We have a meeting of Severian with one of them. One of them. A still huge woman that lives under the water. We learn that Baldanders is also continuously growing and will at some point probably join them in the sea. And we'll see how all of that works out. But we also learn that Vodalas is sort of on their side. The interesting bit here is what I said when I said that is sort of a religious thing, is that Vodalas claims that humanity is obviously fallen. Severian agrees with it, and Severian says we lack wisdom and power. And Vodalas says we still have all the wisdom, we just don't have any power anymore. Now there's a debate on the relation between wisdom and power, intelligence and power, how you use one for the other and so forth, going on there on a deeper level. But Vodalas, who says that he's allied with those beings under the sea, which may be evil, who knows? If there is such a thing as evil in this world, which topic for a different discussion, I guess. And he connects those with power. They're also kind of connected with immortality, because they're obviously very, very long-lived. They just keep on growing, which is sort of the idea of immortality they have espoused. You just keep on growing, because as long as you grow, you don't die. That's a weird idea, but it's kind of what's going on there, I would say. Which is the one side. The other side, however, tries renewal. Instead of continuous growth, the other side is trying to find the new sun and start over again, which is the grand conflict. And Severian is somewhere in that conflict between those two. And there is clear religious overtones with the claw of the Conciliator, stuff that he has done so far. If you think back, he has brought people back from death. He has healed wounded and crippled people. He has turned water into wine. He's on pretty much on a Jesus course right now, to bring back something or return something or initiate the rebirth of something. But on the other hand, he gets tempted all the time by the other side, which also fits the script so far. And it is those interesting aspects that make Book of the New Sun so fascinating, because what we have is obviously a framed narrative. Severian is writing this after his events. He's also obviously aware, because we've seen images of Christian mythology already show up in the story before, the story of St. Catherine and others. So the question is Severian modeling his story after the story of Jesus Christ? Or is there a deeper pattern that a lot of these stories of rebirth are modeled after? Or is Gene Wolfe just fucking with us? Who knows at this point? But it's important to keep that in mind and keep looking at it. And I feel that's the main conflict there, or part of that is the idea of rebirth and starting something new, and the idea of looking back in the past and continuing to live the past or recapture something of the past, which you have with Vodalus and also with Hildegrin and the Cumean, who's another alien who tries to help summon an Inca sun god, I guess, and at the end of the story. So yeah, the idea of rebirth or starting something new or clawing back to the past as the main conflict there for humanity and the world is something that becomes more clear in this novel, I would say, than it was in Shadow of the Torturer. We're still far away from fully having anything explained, obviously, but we're there. We're getting closer. To wrap this up, though, the claw of the Conciliator turns on the weird, makes the world more unique, adds in way more of the science fiction-y elements in this world. They're still fairly fantastic because they're described by someone who doesn't understand anything. Makes a lot of the conflicts more explicit, and has a large, starts to recontextualize stuff that was done before in the first book by adding information or revealing information that has been there all along, but was too well hidden in plain sight for anyone to pick up, or anyone but the most sensitive people to pick up on. And also has a very interesting commentary on sexuality, gender roles, or no gender roles, but gender depiction and body image going on there in the story of Jolanta. We're still not even close to where Severin is supposed to be, which is Thrax. But yeah, it's a crazy ride once again. Now, if you've read this far, let me know what you think about the book. Let's have us a discussion, and I'll talk to you tomorrow about something which hopefully orbs up the throne. And until then, have a great day. Cheers.